Hi, hello everyone, and thank you. Now we can see the slide, so we can definitely start. And let's go. Tom, are you? Great. Let's go over the agenda. So thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm very excited, and we are actually very excited to talk about this topic. As part of the agenda today, we will start by short overview about the following topics with regard to keep calm and deploy Defender for servers. As part of the agenda, we will go with a quick overview, and we will start to go by briefly about explaining what is Defender for Cloud and how specific Defender for Servers fit into that product. We will give a quick overview about Defender for Servers, and we'll talk briefly about the integration with Defender for Endpoint. Agentless scanning is new capability that we have added to the product, so we will cover this as well, and probably we'll have some times for questions and answers. I think we can go for the starting of the show. As you can see here, and if you are not familiar with the purpose of Microsoft Defender for Cloud, Microsoft Defender for Cloud is enabled and give you comprehensive visibility and posture management, threat protection across your multi-cloud environment. If you look at that on the bottom, it's including Azure, AWS, GCP, and on-prem resources. Now, keeping in mind on the left side, we also taking the things to shifting left of the approach. We also gave capabilities around the DevOps and integration with the CI/CD, which means continuous integration and continuous development. We believe that Microsoft Defender for Cloud can really help you and really see which kind of tools organization need and need to have a strong tool in place that can help unify across your secure posture management and across your workload protection. It will provide you guidance on how to best remediate and harden your environment with those resources, regardless where those resources resides, if they are on cloud or even if they are not in cloud, just as an example, as an on-prem. Significant portion of security breaches most of the time happens to poor cybersecurity hygiene. And most of the companies try to focus to harden their environment. And this is actually where Microsoft Defender for Cloud come to help. And specifically, we'll talk about Defender for Servers. So keep that in mind. This is the general approach. It's a process that we believe the Defender for Cloud can help you here and really see what's needed to organization to have a tool in place that can unify across your shifting left strategy, which means starting from the DevOps until to your final deployment. We can go for the next slide. And we already mentioned cloud secure posture management and cloud workload protection. Now you can realize, looking at the right side of the presentation, that we have a kind of coverage about what we can cover today. You need to have a protection across your resources under one roof. And because Defender for Cloud is an Azure native service, many Azure services are monitored and protected with the needing and deployment. But most of the time, you also need to add those resources, if it could be on-prem or either other resources on your clouds that need to be protected. To defend those native resources, Defender for Cloud can help you to detect threat across your Azure PaaS services, meaning that we are able to detect threats targeting your Azure services. It will include things like Azure App Services, SQL, Azure Account, and of course, more data services. And you can also see from the pillar there that we also cover things like data services, network, and can help you to defend your on-prem resources. This is some of kind of the capability, and if you want to extend that protection even to your on-prem environment, we are leveraging Azure Arc to enable Defender for Cloud to enhance those features. So it's really kind of example and give you a sense about what we can cover as of today. We can go for the next slide, Tom. How we do it actually. So Defender for Cloud is really collect your data across your Azure virtual machines, and we're talking specifically today about Defender for Servers, but we are not just collecting from servers. The product itself can collect from containers and even non-Azure resources. It could include on-premise machine, and what we are doing, we can give you kind of tools to give coverage and monitor those securities incidents. It could be vulnerabilities, it could be incident. We'll go of some of those contents around our demonstration today. What we actually focusing is to have all of this data and collect it to a central location that will allow you to go through and detect those kind of incidents and threat and alerts and help you to improve your strategy and improve your security hygiene. You can ask yourself why we need to use Defender for Cloud to deploy monitoring components. Usually visibility is the key. We want to have visibility in one single pane glass of view. So visibility into the security workloads is dependent on the data that the monitoring components will able to require and collect. And we will talk about that briefly later. Tom will explain us what are the key dependencies, what are the components that we have and we need to have as part of our journey to deploy Defender for Service Plan. We are using terminology. Some of them relies on Azure policy with terminology we deploy if not exist. Other are related to some components, and we used to say agent, but we also talk about agentless of today. With that being said, we can go to the next slide. After we install all of our capabilities and we have discovery and we have agent and we have monitoring capabilities, could be agentless, we need to triage those. And we already know that triaging and investigating security alert can be sometimes time consuming for some kind of, even for the mass skills technical analyst, it could be hard to know where to begin. So what we are doing in Defender for Cloud, we're using analytics to help to connect all of this information and actually gives capabilities around these things, those alerts, this connection, and we can provide you a single pane of glass to view all the attack campaign around those alerts. So if you're asking yourself in generalize, we are differentiate between security alerts, which are notifications that we are generating within Defender for Cloud. When threats are identified in your cloud, it could be not just cloud, it could be hybrid or even on your on-prem environment. Security alerts are triggered by advanced detections that we have in Defender for Cloud. And of course, it will rely when you are enabling the enhanced security features. Each kind of alert, and we will look in kind of a demo later, will provide you details about those specific affected resources, issues, and of course will provide you also remediation recommendations. We also have a security incidents capabilities. The main pillar here is security incident is actually a collection of related alerts. Incident will provide you a single view of an attack and its related alerts so that you can understand the action and the attack actors. Now I have my friends with me here. Tom, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for the introduction.
Yeah, and I think we can start really to talk about what we actually are here today, right? We want to talk about Defender for Servers, and there is kind of a lot of misconception about understand. So can you tell us more about the integration that we have today with Defender for Endpoint?
Absolutely. So first of all, before we start talking about the Defender for Endpoint integration in detail, I want to make sure that everyone understands what Defender for Servers actually is from a enablement perspective. We are offering two different plans. We have Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 1, and we have Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2. Now, Plan 2 is what everybody knows as Azure Security Center Standard or Microsoft Defender for Servers back in the days. But we introduced an additional plan at the beginning of this year, which is called Defender for Servers Plan 1. And the value proposition of this plan is actually to allow you to have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration for all machines that are covered with Defender for Servers Plan 1. There's one additional capability that oftentimes is underrated or misunderstood, which is about the foundational CSPM aspect. Now, foundational CSPM actually is a free capability inside Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and it is free for Azure VMs, for AWS EC2 instances, and also for GCP Compute. And not only for AWS EC2 and GCP Compute, but basically for all resources that reside in Azure, in AWS, or in GCP environments if you're using the multi-cloud connectors. But for on-prem servers, as soon as Azure Arc comes into play, then there are three security recommendations as part of foundational CSPM that require Microsoft Defender for Servers to be enabled, which is about the missing OS patches assessment, the security misconfigurations, and also the endpoint protection assessment. Just keep that in mind that for foundational CSPM, you actually do not need Defender for Servers. But when it comes to these three security recommendations for on-prem machines, Defender for Servers is required if you're using Azure Arc on top of that. Now, the good news is that all the capabilities of Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 1 are also included in Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2. So if you're looking for Microsoft Defender for endpoint integration, you actually don't have to make the decision which of our plans you're looking for, because both of them will provide you with the Microsoft Defender vulnerability management capability that provides you with vulnerability assessment findings and with the software inventory. And you also will get the integration with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint's EDR capabilities. Also, the automated onboarding that allows us to directly deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to your machines is something that is included there. And then in Plan 2, as I mentioned before, this is the plan that you know from back in the days, with all the cloud-native detections and cloud-native controls that include file integrity monitoring, adaptive application controls, just-in-time VM access, but also OS level and network-based threat detection outside of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So there is an additional value there. But we are not going to cover these in detail today, because that is something we did about 4 weeks ago in the other webinar. Today, we want to focus on 2 additional components, and this is the Agentless vulnerability scanning that we recently introduced at Microsoft Ignite, and also the Microsoft Defender vulnerability management add-on. That is something that, from my perspective, people are not really aware of what it actually is. The MDVM add-on includes security baseline assessments, vulnerable applications can be blocked, browser extensions, digital certificate assessments, and also network share analysis. This actually is a component that came from, or as an addition for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint for client systems. And with Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2, we are also giving you that capability on top of the capabilities that always have been part of the Defender for Servers Plan 2. And then the Agentless vulnerability scanning is a capability that is part of 2 different plans, Defender for Servers Plan 2 and Defender CSPM, and we will cover that in detail later on in this presentation. So when we talk about Defender for Endpoint deployment, and I mentioned before that this is an automated process in the backend, this is the experience that you will have in all the new subscriptions that you're creating on Azure. So Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration is enabled by default, and this is what is done by this checkbox. So if you create a new subscription, this checkbox will be enabled in all environments if you go to the Defender for Cloud environment settings and take a look there. So all you need to do is enable Defender for Servers Plan 1 or Plan 2, and then we will take care of deploying Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to all your Azure VMs and to all your Azure Arc connected machines. Now, this is just the default on most, but not on all subscriptions. There might be subscriptions in which you will find the Enable Unified Solution button. Now, this button is a capability that we introduced when we released the MDE Unified Solution integration into Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2. And this button appears in case you have a subscription that had been created before June 20th this year, that also had Defender for Servers Plan 2 and the MDE integration enabled. In this case, you will see this button. So in other words, if you have a subscription that had been enabled last year, but that did not have Defender for Servers enabled, you won't see the button if you enable Defender for Servers today. If you had switched off the MDE integration and you switch it on again, you won't see this button. If you don't see the button, that doesn't mean something is wrong. It actually just means that MDE Unified Solution integration is enabled on that subscription. And as I said, this is the default for new subscriptions. And what we actually did is we introduced that button to make sure we are not enforcing you to upgrade to the MDE Unified Solution. So if you are a user that has been using Defender for Servers Plan 2 back in the days with MDE integration, and you're still relying on the MMA-based MDE solution for Windows Server 2012 R2 and 2016, then this is fine. You don't have to upgrade, but we encourage you to upgrade because it will offer a variety of additional benefits and capabilities. And then there's a second button that you might have seen, which is the Enable for Linux Machines button. There we have a similar situation. Back in August 2021, we introduced MDE integration for Linux machines. Until then, only Windows machines have been covered. And so we introduced that new solution. And we wanted to make sure not to break existing environments. We didn't want to enforce our customers to deploy MDE to Linux machines. And this, again, is like an opt-in capability. So if you want to have that, you need to click it. If your subscription had been created later than August 2021, or if you did not have MDE integration or Defender for Servers enabled, then you just won't see this button, which doesn't mean something is wrong. It just means everything is set up according to the best practices and to the default configuration. We have challenges with these older subscriptions. While it is an opt-in solution, we are actually requiring our customers an additional effort. So you need to click that button in every subscription, or you need to do something in order to get the subscription aligned with the security best practices. Customers oftentimes forget about that, and that results in the lack of coverage. So although customers oftentimes want to have MDE deployed to all their machines, to Linux and Windows, and they want to leverage the latest version, which is the MDE Unified solution for Windows Server 2012 R2 and 2016, they might be missing out of that just because they do not know they need to click these buttons. And clicking these buttons actually means this is an API request. So if you click the button, a put request will be submitted against the Microsoft.security/settings REST API provider. And the setting name for the Linux integration is wdatp exclude Linux public preview. And this setting needs to be set to false. So you basically need to switch off the exclusion for the Linux public preview. Let me rephrase that. You're switching off that capability to get the Linux deployment enabled on your environment, because what we actually did is we excluded every subscription back in the days when the integration was in a public preview. And this is why wdatp exclude Linux public preview needs to be set to false. But this happens when you click the button. In other words, you could also use an automation. For example, we have published a PowerShell script that will basically do exactly this. It will do a little bit more because it will check if MDE integration has already been enabled. If not, it will just enable MDE integration in your set. If it has been enabled, we will check if the MDE integration for Linux is disabled, and if so, we will just enable that one. And then for the unified solution, it's pretty similar, but the setting is a different one. It's called WDATP Unified Solution. And by the way, WDATP is the old acronym for what we today call Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So that was the old product name, and the APIs are usually not changed. So this means the setting is as it is, and you can still leverage this setting in the latest API version today. And now this WDATP Unified Solution setting, that needs to be enabled. So you need to set enabled to true, just to give you that indication. And what you can do is you can use PowerShell, you can use a REST API call for all your subscriptions. You can build an ARM template that will set this particular setting. You can use Terraform scripts, or you can use an Azure policy that will basically make sure that this setting is set to all of your existing subscriptions. And then we will deploy MDE. And now deploy MDE means we will deploy an extension to your Azure Arc machines and to your Azure VMs. The extension is called mde.linux or mde.windows. And once this extension is connected with a machine, the onboarding process will start. Now you see there is provisioning failed in my screenshot. This doesn't mean that the extension has not been connected with that server. It just means the onboarding process failed. And there are some myths regarding the MDE extensions. The extension itself is not the agent or the sensor. The extension is the management interface we are using, so we are able to deploy MDE to your machines. The extension status, as I said, reflects the onboarding status of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint in the operating system. So if it says provisioning is failed, there will be an error message that tells you why the provisioning failed. For example, in Linux, that could mean that there is another EDR solution deployed that will use the Notify kernel extension. In this case, MDE will not be deployed to this machine. Or it could mean on Windows, let's assume you have a Windows Server 2016 machine, that you have not met all the prerequisites, such as enabling Microsoft Defender antivirus on that machine, which needs to be done before you can deploy the MDE unified solution to the machine. But you will see that in the error message. So the error message actually tells you what is wrong in this environment. And one cool thing is that the onboarding process that is started by the extension will detect an existing installation of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on your machine and then just connect it in the backend. So for customers that, for example, have on-prem servers that are deployed in a manual or a config management solution-based approach to get MDE deployed to these machines, they want to migrate to Microsoft Defender for servers. They can easily do by deploying the Azure Arc component on top of that on-prem server, connect the machine to the Azure subscription. Then we will deploy the extension on top of that Azure Arc resource. The deployment process will start and will detect that, hey, there is an MD installation already. I don't need to install anything. I don't need to upgrade anything. I just need to make sure to connect the dots in the backends. And as of then, you will get all your vulnerability assessment findings and your security alerts that are created by the MDE sensor directly into the Microsoft Defender for Cloud portal. So that's a very, very interesting approach there when it comes to upgrading. We have published a MDE deployment status workbook, and this is something that we will see in the demo later. But to give you an idea, that workbook actually will give you an indication if or if not the extension has been deployed to your machines. And if it has been deployed, what's the status? So was it succeeded? Provisioning failed, whatever status you might have, then you will find that out easily by using that workbook. And with that being said, I want to give it over to you, my friend, to guide us through the demo.
Thank you. Wow, that was great. So I just need to demo some of the stuff, right, Tom? So let's start maybe with the integration. Let me take over.
Yeah.
And share my screen. And please acknowledge. Good.
I can see it.
Awesome. So let's start with the context about understanding what we can actually do and how to enable the integration. We talked about, Tom explained us about MDE integration. So if I look at my environment, I'm in the blade of Microsoft Defender for Cloud overview page. I can go to the management section, to the highlight the section which named as environment settings. And then I could explain my environment and look for the hierarchy that I have onboarded. So I will go already to the subscription that I've chosen, and I will need to navigate to the integration. Like Tom mentioned, this checkbox already be able and function for me. This will allow Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to access my data. But if I want also to enable the unified solution, to allow unified solution and Defender for Cloud to support Microsoft Defender for Endpoint for Windows 2012 R2 and Windows 2016, like Tom mentioned, it's need to be done via this button, via REST API or other method that you can done at scale. It's the same functionality that we have here also for Linux machine. Now, after we enable this, it's probably need to do some coverage with respect to which ones of the machines that we have already onboarded in the successfully way. So what we have published to our repository, it's an artifact which is based on a JSON template. It's a customized workbook that we usually deploy, and we can deploy to our Azure environment. And this workbook can be deployed via the button, and the button will require you to add your subscription target, resource group, and that will deploy to your current environment. After you will deploy that workbook, it will take place in the area of the workbook sections, and you can see it under the stage of kind of the light blue ones. So I already deployed that, and it's looked like I already done some work on my environment, but Tom, look, I have some machines that I even need to work later on that. So probably those machines need to be highlighted. So the green kind of status bar will tell me how many of my machines reported a succeeded kind of onboarding. So if I click on that, it will open me a data grid downstairs that I can look and figure out which one of the machine have succeeded deployed with the extension. And if I look, of course, on the failed status, it need to be tell, and then I can look definitely on the stage and the status and what is the failure. Keep that in mind that everything that we are doing here is done by a resource graph queries, so you can definitely customize it. And we're also covering the Azure Arc machines. So it's not just for Azure, also in hybrid and Azure Arc instances as well. So this is something you definitely can do today on your environment if you enable Defender for Servers and you enabled already the integration with MDE, with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and you go with Unified. Keep that in mind that some of the failure could be relevant to things like missing pre-requirements. Tom mentioned things like cumulative update. It could be kind of situation that you are missing on your machine. Specifically, if we are talking about Unified, for example, with 2012 and 2016, there are pre-requirements to be with the latest roll-up and, of course, having in place the capability of anti-malware and things like that. So you definitely want to go through and make sure all of machine have those pre-requirements before you go with that deployments, just to make sure that you are on track. The last thing that we want to highlight is kind of example, what's the benefit of getting enabled Defender for Servers? So if you look at that kind of pillar, I am in the section of security alerts now, and I explained about two kind of example. One is security alert, and the other is security incident, which you can do and look here. I have those kind of example, and one is actually highlight has a specific alert, and the other will be an incident. Let's go as an example, what are the benefits of having those integration? And let's jump into the alert that I'm raising right now. And this alert was actually popped from my machine. So you can ask yourself and say, okay, this is kind to be a legitimate PowerShell process. But what you can see here, that what we are doing over the legitimacy of the PowerShell is leveraging some base 64 command. It could be obfuscation command that the attacker leveraged to bypass the execution policy on our machine. Now, this kind of functionality is coming with the integration with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So we can see a combination of two PowerShell tools in the same pillar to give us flexibility about alert that is coming using just a simple kind of application, which is WinWord. So having said that, those are the entities which are related to that alert. And of course, I can take some action to improve my security posture. I can work to mitigate that alert. I can work to prevent that alert. I can even leverage things like automation and run logic up to make sure something's gonna run automatically if I want to take action and actually perform this. Now let's talk about an example of incident. Now you can ask yourself, if you don't remember, incident, it's a correlation of some of the alerts. Now you can see here the same alert that I was highlighting, but here it's a combination about intervolving our anti-malware solution. So we can see from the perspective of the flow that we started with a suspicious use of PowerShell detected on my machine, and then the anti-malware get into the place and try to action and perform some things on my machine, which makes sense because it could be a combination that the attacker also try to overcome and try to disable my solution on my machine. It could be Microsoft Defender for Endpoint in that case, and this is something we definitely want to take caution and of course handle that. So it could be a correlation event and correlation of alert with regards to the same story that try to help us to improve and interact with our security environment. I think that's give us some of sense about some of the integration capability that we have today with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and capability of alerts. But Tom, I think we are missing something. Maybe you can explain us more what we can do with the agentless story.
Absolutely. And before we start with talking about agentless, I just want to summarize what you need to do in order to deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to your machines. So basically what you do is you enable Defender for Servers, either Plan 1 or Plan 2 on your Azure subscription. If you have Azure VMs, they will automatically be covered and they will get the solution deployed. Like we deploy the extension, we will either deploy the sensor or we will detect an existing installation and just connect it in the backend. If you have on-prem servers, you want to deploy Azure Arc to these machines, then these machines will be connected to the same Azure subscription, and then the same process will kick in. So we will deploy the MD extension, and then we will detect existing installations, or we will make sure to just deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and connect it in the backend, which then means you will get the security alerts, vulnerability findings, software inventory directly into Microsoft Defender for Cloud Portal, and at the same time, you will see it in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint's portal. Now, with agentless scanning, that's a pretty new motion that we recently introduced at the last Microsoft Ignite. As we mentioned before, agents are important, but relying solely on agents can be, well, at least challenging. It can, mean that there might be some issues in your environment. With an agent, you might be able to deploy to some of your machines using an automated process, but then you might have machines that are only living for a short period of time. You have installation failures like the ones that we have seen before, where the extension says MDE could not be deployed to a machine. And limited connectivity today might pose you to real issues because the Log Analytics agent, the Azure Monitor agent, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, basically all agents that you can deploy to a machine need to be able to communicate with its backend. So there need to be some kind of network connectivity for these machines. So there are common challenges. There's a continuous deployment effort. You need to make sure that the agent is being deployed, either using an automated process or by using a manual approach. You always depend on workload owners because you cannot just go ahead and deploy something to a machine that you do not own. So from a security perspective, you always have to get in touch with these folks. And there might be short-living VMs that you cannot even get hold of. So the machine might be spin up, and then if you want to deploy the agent, it might already have been, shut down. This is why we have been introducing the agentless scanning capability. And in the first draft, we have that for software inventory and vulnerability scanning. The advantage here is we will get the coverage for vulnerability assessments and software inventory results within a few hours. There's no performance impact on the machine itself. You don't need to have any network connectivity, and it is completely transparent to workload owners. So we're not deploying something into a machine. We're just leveraging the platform capability to create a snapshot of a machine, to scan that one, and to give you the results directly into the portal. We call this a hybrid security approach. Not hybrid because we are spinning on-prem machines and also cloud environments. Hybrid in this scenario means we are leveraging both agentless and agent-based scenarios. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint is an agent-based scenario, and it totally makes sense because with that you get deep OS visibility. You will know what processes are running on the machine. We see the communications, and based on that we can create security alerts in real time. And this is the second topic, real-time monitoring and detection of attacks. Without an agent, you're not able to create something in real time. And it is active. So what we can do is we can basically block a machine from communicating. We can shut down a process. We can make sure that an anti-malware action is being taken. For all of that, you need to have an agent. But there are capabilities you don't have to have an agent for, which is the OS visibility into, or the visibility into the OS posture issues, into vulnerability assessment findings. You don't have any performance impact on these workloads, which means that it actually doesn't care the workload owner if or if not you're scanning that machine. And you do not depend on the workload owners for getting that solution enabled. And how it works is pretty interesting, actually, because what we do, and this is currently available for AWS and for Azure, what we do is we will create a disk snapshot of a machine in a customer's environment. This snapshot is being used in an isolated scanning environment in that same region, which means that this snapshot will never leave the region boundaries, no matter if that is on AWS or on Azure. So that means on AWS, we have our own Microsoft-owned environment that we can leverage to scan this disk snapshot. And we will use the same scanning platform as we are using for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and this is MDVM. So basically what we do is we have the Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management backend, and we can feed the metadata directly to the MDVM backend, similar to what the MDE sensor on the machine will do. And then these findings will be reported back to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud portal. So in our portal, we will be able to show you these VA findings. And the cool thing there is that it is completely transparent from a user perspective. So you do not actually see if that finding has been created by the MDE sensor running on a machine, or on a machine that does not have the MDE sensor, if it has been created by the agentless VA scanning. Now, what we did is we included the agentless scanning capability for machines in 2 different plans. Microsoft Defender CSPM is a plan that we introduced at Microsoft Ignite that will allow you to have enhanced CSPM, Cloud Security Posture Management capabilities. That include attack path analysis, that also include the security map that we have introduced that allows you to build your own attack paths if you want to, and to find out and make an educated decision which are the assets that you need to focus on first. Within that plan, it totally makes sense to have agentless VA scanning as being a part of, because vulnerability assessment scanning actually is a part of cloud security posture management. It's not cloud workload protection per se, so we're not doing like a security alert. We're just giving you visibility into misconfigurations and tell you, hey, there is a vulnerable software, you should make sure to upgrade that or to remove it from that machine. So in Defender CSPM, we will give you the enhanced visibility on the OS level security posture by leveraging agentless VA scanning. Those findings are shared with the security graph, which means that we will directly feed the attack path analysis feature as part of Defender CSPM, but also the underlying security graph on which you can build your own queries. And there's no need to deploy an agent just for getting the vulnerability and software inventory insights on a machine. So it totally makes sense to have that agentless scanning capability as part of Defender CSPM. But it also totally makes sense to have it as part of Defender for Servers Plan 2. Although we have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration with Defender for Servers, in our Plan 2, which, if you recall back, what is the list of capabilities that we have in there, in Plan 2, we are offering enhanced capabilities on top of just the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration. What we do is we're shifting the agent-based scenarios to the right. We're not saying get rid of agents, because that's not going to happen. But as you have seen also, Shay, in your workbook that you just demonstrated, there might be machines that didn't even get the MD extension yet. Or if they got it, the installation failed. Or you might have machines that are in an isolated network environment that are not able to communicate outside of these boundaries. Or you might decide not to go all in with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on day one, but to gradually deploy MDE to your machines. So for example, if you have 1,000 machines and you're deploying MDE on 10 machines per day, that will take you 100 workdays before you will have Microsoft Defender for Endpoint sensor deployed to all machines. Now with agentless scanning, you will get vulnerability assessment insights as of day one, because after 24 hours, or in other words, once every 24 hours, we will be scanning your assets and we'll give you VA findings for these machines. So as I said, it totally makes sense to have both plans, or to have that capability in both plans, because they are offering, well, the plans are offering different capabilities, but agentless scanning actually will serve for different scenarios, either in Defender CSPM or when it comes to integrating with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And there again, we have a CVE dashboard, which is another workbook that we created to give you insights into the VA findings. There was a great question in the chat earlier where someone asked about CVE findings. In Defender for Cloud, you will see a security recommendation. In that recommendation, you see the vulnerabilities. And if you click a vulnerability, you will then see what are the affected resources and also what are the CVE IDs that are part of that vulnerability finding. The dashboard turns it around, so you will be able to see the CVEs directly and filter for them, and then you can see what's the actual vulnerability and what is the resource that is being affected by a particular CVE. And with that being said, I again want to give it over to you, my friend, for a demo about agentless scanning and the workbooks that we have.
Wow, that was great. I mean, the agentless section was interesting, so just need to demo it a little bit, right, Tom? So let's try to
absolutely
reshare again.
Yep.
And please acknowledge when you can see the screen or not yet. Just a second. Now we could see it, right?
I can see it now. Yep.
Awesome. So we talked about agentless, how we enable agentless. Let's start with the Azure side. I'm in the same blade of Microsoft Defender for Cloud. Go to environment settings. I just expand my hierarchy going on the top of the management group and expand the specific subscription that I want to go to and enable it. Now, this is something that we can enable via the plan. We talked about integration, but right now we are focusing on the Defender for Servers. You remember the topic, right? Keep calm and deploy Defender for Servers. So if you look at my environment, I am in the monitoring coverage about the partial setting stage. If I go to that blade and click on the settings pillar, you will be able to see that I can enable the agentless scanning for machines. Now, this capability will allow me to deploy the agentless scanning capability like Tom explained us, and I will have coverage on my environment. Now, if I enable it, I just need to switch it to on and save it on my environment, which I already done to save us some time. So after enabling this, and to reply to the question that Tom already explained about that, it will be the same of how we use in Defender for Cloud as a product of today. Most of the things that we are populating, it could be related to recommendation, which help you to secure and harden and to improve your security posture. Now, one of them is related to vulnerability, which is coming from that area, and Tom explained us about. Its machine should have vulnerability finding resolved. Now, it could become, like Tom mentioned, from TVM, it could become even from the agentless side, right, Tom? If we have machines that we don't even have the extension, but it's reading by an agentless anyway, if I go to that recommendation and go deep into that, so it will show me all of the affected resources, and all of the affected resources, if I click on one specific CVE, for example, it will give me all the metadata and information that it related. You can see even on the top of it, which solution is provide you that capability, which is coming from Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management, and what are the severity score and the CVSS score that's related to that. So easy to remember, right? Keep calm. Just enable the functionality, enable the plan, use the recommendation that we are provide you, and you don't need to take care about how we populate the data for you. We do it in our backend. You just need to use the recommendation to consume that data. Now, this is one functionality that we have with regarding to Defender for Servers. It could also be a possibility to enable it via DCSPM plan. And in our last webinar, we explained that capability as well. Now, not just Azure. If you remember, our context is that we are covering also AWS as well. So if I look and expand my environment just again and go back to my hierarchy, I'm looking on my AWS account. And if I click on that account, you will be able to the same functionality, monitoring coverage. If I click on that settings from partial, it's the same functionality of agentless scanning capability that I can switch to on. Now you can ask yourself, is it going to be on the same recommendation blade? Of course, the answer is yes. We are saving you the context of needing to switch between the blades to consume this data. So keep calm. You can just enable this functionality. We'll try to provision the agentless scanning whenever we can. If you're already done and have that agent, fine, we can use that as well. But all of the same to make your life, and of course, with the post for the meaning of make your environment secure. Last thing to remind is the CV dashboard, Tom. We mentioned about it, and it will give some sense about coverage. With CV, we have in our environment how it's tackled with regarding to respects to the specific provider that we have enabled. So I've already deployed that. The same functionality, same JSON format. You just need to deploy to your environment, use and select the specific subscription, resource group, go with the same terminology. After you deploy that, it will come to the same pillar of workbooks. And this is really great because this could also help you if you want to switch between the solution, if you have Qualys or TVM, it doesn't matter. And then you will have a single kind of a view about your effectiveness CVEs by specific ID across your environment. If you want to consume more data, if you just click on a specific CV item on the data grid, you will be able to see which actually resource is related to that CV. So let's assume you have you want to focus specific on a Log4j or an Open SSL vulnerability. You can do it from here and consume that vulnerability details. Again, just to remind, it's based on the same terminology of consuming Azure Resource Graph queries on the top of KQL. And I think this makes sense about how you can use and consume and keep calm when you are deploying your Defender for Service solution. With that being said, Tom, I think we can maybe give a brief about the agent coverage that we have in Defender for Cloud, right? Just to close the topics and connect the dots around it. Maybe you can go on that one.
Absolutely, yeah. Let me just take over the screen again.
Sure.
And while the screen is loading, I think that there's one sentence that I want to emphasize because now we have agent-based and agent-less scanning capabilities, right? So we are able to scan for vulnerabilities on a machine using several scenarios. And the question might be, hey, will I end up with having several vulnerability findings for the actual same software? And the answer is no, because what happens is agentless scanning will be in place and it will scan a machine. And as long as no agent-based vulnerability assessment solution will report to Microsoft Defender for Cloud, the agent-less scanning capability will feed its findings into our dashboard. So that means that you can enable both MDE integration and agentless VA scanning on the same subscription. If your machine has the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint sensor deployed and it is already reporting to the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint backend, we will use that information and highlight it in the Defender for Cloud portal. So only if the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint sensor is not yet deployed or it is not reporting, then we will use the agentless scanning capability, which means that agent-based scanning will always take precedence over the agentless scanning. Okay. Now, you mentioned the agent-based scenarios, and I think this is something we definitely need to take a closer look at, because there are some agent-based scenarios that are not necessarily connected with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, but rather with the Log Analytics agent or the Azure Monitor agent. Now, we need to be careful. In our last webinar, we also explained that the Azure Monitor agent itself is a GA agent. You can use that agent on your machine, so there's no lack of supportability from the agent perspective. We are in public preview when it comes to the integration with Microsoft Defender for Cloud and Microsoft Defender for Servers. So that means that if you want to leverage adaptive application controls, file integrity monitoring, OS level and fileless attack detections as part of Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2, and you want to use the Azure Monitor agent, you need to be aware that this is just public preview from a capability perspective. So what you can do is, and these scenarios that I just mentioned, file integrity monitoring, adaptive application controls, and OS level fileless attack detections, these are scenarios in Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2 only. You won't get them in Defender for Servers Plan 1. In other words, in Defender for Servers Plan 1, we actually only offer the capability of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration. And you remember the agent-based security recommendations, OS baseline recommendation, endpoint protection, and anti-malware and EDR recommendations. These are created by the Log Analytics agent. So if you don't have the agent on your machines, then you will basically, in Plan 1, you will miss out of these capabilities. In Plan 2, you will have a tighter integration with Log Analytics and the Azure Monitor agent, which means that in Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2, you want to make sure that you have the monitoring agent, no matter if it is the Log Analytics or the Azure Monitor agent, deployed to your machines so that you can benefit from all of these capabilities here. Now, when it comes to the OS baseline recommendation, this is something, this is a little bit unique because the OS baseline recommendation in Defender for Cloud will assess your operating system for operating system configurations, and it will map that against an integrated security baseline that we have for Windows and for Linux machines. This capability is based on the Log Analytics agent. With Azure Monitor agent, we're not using that agent, we are using the guest config extension. So this is a capability of Azure Policy that allows us to also look into the operating system. And this guest config extension, for example, is part of Azure Arc already. So Azure Arc comes with that capability. So there's not yet another capability that you would have to install from an agent perspective, actually. However, this is a matrix that I believe totally makes sense for you to understand what are the agents that you need to deploy for what capability. You usually are selecting one of those only, so Log Analytics or the Azure Monitor agent. You don't want to put both agents on the same machine, forgetting file integrity monitoring. You're deciding to have file integrity monitoring with Azure Monitor agent, for example, or with the Log Analytics agent. Defender for Endpoint will provide you with the OS level and fileless attack detections outside of Defender for Servers Plan 2, and also with anti-malware and EDR. Because Microsoft Defender Antivirus is a component that will also be installed alongside the Defender for Endpoint sensor. And the integrated vulnerability assessment capability that, as I said, is either part of Microsoft Defender for Endpoint or the agentless scanning, or you could leverage the Qualys VA extension. That's an additional agent that we are giving you as part of Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 2. And there's a common question that we're getting, like, hey, Tom, am I supposed to use Qualys over Defender for Endpoint's TVM capability? Or is it better to use TVM instead of, or I'm sorry, Microsoft Defender Vulnerability Management instead of Qualys? Or does agentless VA scanning give me the best insights into what is going on my machines? Now, the answer is it depends. As part of Microsoft Defender for Servers Plan 1, you will only have the Defender for Endpoint solution. In Defender for Servers Plan 2, you have all the three options. Agentless VA scanning is something that I would suggest every Defender for Servers Plan 2 customers to enable, because it will bridge that gap in case MDE has not yet been deployed to your machines. For Qualys, this is a solution for customers that are leveraging another EDR component on their machines, but at the same time want to leverage, for example, adaptive application controls or file integrity monitoring as part of Microsoft Defender for Service Plan 2. In this case, they can leverage the Qualys VA extension, so they will at least get the vulnerability insights, although they then will not have the software inventory that comes as part of MDVM integration. So as a final statement here, the agent-based scenarios actually come into play for foundational CSPM and for Defender for Service Plan 2. When it comes to Defender for Service Plan 1, it all comes down to the Defender for Endpoint agent in general, because that is the core value proposition. And if you want to get Defender for Endpoint deployed to your servers, you would like to leverage Microsoft Defender for Servers, because that way you can benefit from license coverage, you can benefit from the integration into Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and you can benefit from the automated deployment process, no matter if that is an Azure VM or a machine that is connected via Azure Arc. And with that being said, I think we can open it up for some questions, in case there are still some questions remaining. I believe we had a great interaction in the chat already, and already thank you for the team for answering all these questions. But yeah, happy to take some if there are some questions left.
Yeah, we do have a few. The first one is, if you enable Defender for Cloud on your subscription, is there a way to prevent immediate deployment to all servers in your subscription, i.e. allow a staged deployment to facilitate phased replacement of existing AV?
That's a great question. Yeah. I assume this is referring to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So the plans that I mentioned, the two plans, Microsoft Defender for Service Plan 1 and Plan 2, they are enabled on a subscription. So by default, and this is, maybe let me just go back to that one slide where I had that screenshot. By default, we will be enabling, here we go, we will be enabling the MDE integration already on the subscription. What you can do is you can switch that off. Mm-hmm. And we do have built-in policy definitions to deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint to your machines. This is one policy initiative that contains 4 policy definitions, and there are 2 definitions for Linux and 2 for Windows, and then divided by Azure VMs and Azure Arc machines. So you can basically select which one you want to assign, and then the deployment and the integration will only take place on the assignment scope. That means that if you switch off the MDE integration here, which is this checkbox, and you then leverage that policy initiative and assign it to, let's say, just a resource group, then that way you can deploy MDE to only machines in that particular resource group. Now coming back to agentless scanning, at the same time, you can enable agentless scanning on top of the subscription, so you will get software inventory and vulnerability assessment results already for all the other machines in that subscription while you're running that staged approach of deploying Microsoft Defender for Endpoint.
Yeah, I think it's also a good approach if we have like subscription, right, Tom, and we want to maintain it by our own, like kind of go with the manual deployment. And this is definitely how we can do it with policy assignment on a subscription, and then you can go through and examine those to make sure you are aligned to that. So it's definitely makes sense.
And also, just to add on that, because that's a common question within the same scope, customers oftentimes ask for what happens if I want to use my own config management solution. So I don't want to leverage the built-in process. I want to use, I don't know, SCCM, Ansible, maybe a GPO or whatever approach they are leveraging. They can do, right? So they can use that approach to deploy Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, because as soon as we connect, or basically as soon as we deploy the MDE extension, we will detect that there is an MDE installation already on the machine and just connect it in the backend. That's it. So you have all the different capabilities there.
Great, thank you. The next question we have is, do these Defender alerts and events get auto-logged to Log Analytics workspace, or does it require manual configuration?
It's also a great question.
Definitely. So yeah, it will require to enable continuous export. And of course, as of today, they are set for 90 days. If you want, you can configure it and export all of the data to Log Analytic Workspace and consume and connect it to any external SIEM solution. So the answer is yes, it's possible, but you need to configure it. This named as continuous export functionality.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
The next question is, the Linux integration is only for use with an Azure Linux VM. Is that correct?
No, it's not. So the Linux integration applies to all the machines that are connected, no matter if that is an Azure VM or an Azure VM on Azure is an Azure VM, or if you have an Azure Arc machine. So if that is an on-prem server, or also, for example, if you leverage the AWS or GCP multi-cloud connectors, as soon as you enable Defender for Servers on top of the connector, we will also deploy Azure Arc, and then that Azure Arc machine will show up in the Azure subscription and will get the full coverage for MDE. So the answer is Linux integration applies to all machines, no matter if that is an Azure VM or if it's connected via Azure Arc.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what I would like to do is stage a rollout of MDE to a subsection of Azure Arc servers. Is there a way to do this presently?
Yeah, it's basically the same what I mentioned before with using that policy-based approach. So switch off the MDE integration on the subscription and leverage the built-in policies. That way you can make sure to just to just deploy MDE to a subset of machines, which then would be a resource group on which you can assign the policy.
Great, thank you. That seems to be all the questions we have. So I'd like to thank you, Shay and Tom, for being our guests today and for an excellent presentation. And thank you to the rest of the team who helped answer questions. At the same time, I would like to remind the listeners that the best way to ensure you don't miss any future webinars or major announcements is to visit our landing page at aka.ms/security-community. And while there, you'll find easy ways to navigate and find the resources and learning content relevant to our security products and their communities. A good start would be browsing our bite-sized product videos, ninja trainings, recordings of past webinars, GitHub communities, and more. We love to hear your feedback on how we can improve these webinars. Please take a minute submitting your webinar feedback at aka.ms/security-webinar feedback. Thank you and see you next time. Goodbye.